2 hours. That's how long a racist bank manager made a black man wait while effortlessly serving white customers. But what he didn't know, he had just disrespected the most powerful man in the building. When the board members walked in and rushed to greet their VIP guest, the manager's smirk vanished. His face turned pale, and in that moment, he knew his career was over. The bank was cold, sterile. A faint hum of quiet conversations and the occasional clatter of keyboards filled the air. But beneath it all, there was something heavier, a silent hierarchy, an unspoken rule dictating who mattered and who did not. Jordan Bennett shifted in his chair, exhaling slowly as he checked his watch for the 5th time. 1 hour and 52 minutes. His patience was wearing thin, but he kept his expression unreadable. He knew this game well. He had played it before, in boardrooms where he was the only black man in the room, in restaurants where waiters pretended not to see him, and now, in this grand marble-floored bank, he was playing it again. He had walked in nearly 2 hours ago, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, his posture commanding yet calm. He had approached the front desk with a warm but firm smile, placing his documents neatly in front of the receptionist. "Good morning. I have an appointment with the manager," he had said politely. The young woman at the counter, blonde, flustered, had barely looked at him. "Take a seat. Someone will be with you shortly." Shortly. Jordan had watched as others, white men in crisp shirts, white women in pastel blouses, arrived long after him and were helped almost immediately. He watched as they were greeted with enthusiasm, ushered to desks, offered coffee. Yet he remained invisible. The bank manager, Thomas Whitaker, a middle-aged man with graying temples and an air of self-importance, had locked eyes with Jordan the moment he walked in. He had looked him up and down, his lips curling ever so slightly, before deliberately turning away. Every time Jordan had politely inquired about his meeting, Thomas had responded the same way. "We're a little busy today. You'll need to wait." Wait. That word carried weight, heavier than the plush leather seats in the waiting area. It was a word that had followed Jordan all his life. Wait your turn. Wait for permission. Wait to be acknowledged. He clenched his jaw as yet another man, a younger white executive, walked in and was immediately greeted with a handshake from Thomas. "Right this way, Mr. Collins." Jordan swallowed the lump rising in his throat. He wasn't just a customer. He wasn't some walk-in hoping to open a basic checking account. He had scheduled this meeting weeks in advance. He was here on official business. And yet, here he was, still waiting. He inhaled deeply, pushing back the familiar sting of humiliation. He reminded himself who he was. Jordan Bennett, CEO. A man who had built his empire from nothing, who had fought twice as hard to earn a seat at tables that were never meant for him. He wasn't just another black man they could ignore, and in precisely 8 minutes, they were going to find out just how badly they had misjudged him. Because the board members were on their way. Jordan tapped his fingers against the armrest, his expression unreadable. But inside, a storm brewed. He had built companies from the ground up. He had sat across from billionaires, negotiated deals worth more than this entire branch's yearly revenue. And yet, here he was, waiting, as if his time meant nothing. The receptionist glanced at him for a split second, then quickly looked away, guilt flashing across her face. She knew. They all knew. But no one was willing to say anything, to challenge the system in place. Jordan inhaled deeply. No more. His phone buzzed. A simple text lit up the screen. "We're here. Heading inside now." A slow smile crept across his lips. At that moment, the heavy wooden doors swung open. 5 impeccably dressed executives stepped in, their polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. The air in the bank shifted. Conversations lowered. Every employee, including Thomas Whitaker, snapped to attention. Whitaker straightened his tie, his confidence returning as he prepared to greet them, until his eyes landed on Jordan. Jordan, who was no longer just the man he had ignored for 2 hours. Jordan, who stood up slowly, buttoning his suit with deliberate precision. Jordan, who now met his eyes with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. The board members walked right past Whitaker, and then they stopped in front of Jordan. Whitaker's smirk vanished. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Something was very, very wrong. Jordan extended his hand to the chairman. "Glad you could make it." The chairman grinned, shaking his hand firmly. "Wouldn't miss it. Sorry we kept you waiting." The entire bank fell silent, and Whitaker's face turned ghostly pale. The tension in the room was suffocating. Employees who had once stolen glances at Jordan with indifference now stared, wide-eyed, at the unfolding scene. Customers waiting in line stopped mid-conversation, sensing that something major was happening. But no one was more frozen than Thomas Whitaker. His eyes darted from Jordan to the board members, his brain desperately trying to piece together what he had just witnessed. This wasn't possible. The man he had dismissed, the man he had intentionally made wait for 2 hours, was standing shoulder to shoulder with the most powerful figures in the company. Jordan turned slowly, his calm, deliberate movements a stark contrast to the sheer panic creeping into Whitaker's face. "You must be Mr. Whitaker," Jordan said, his voice smooth, yet dripping with authority. Whitaker forced a smile, though his face had gone pale. Yes, I'm the branch manager here." Jordan gave a slow nod. "Branch manager. Right." He let the words hang, studying Whitaker the way a lion studies prey. "And tell me, Mr. Whitaker, how do you prioritize your customers?" Whitaker's lips parted, but no words came out. Beads of sweat formed at his temples. One of the board members, an older man with salt and pepper hair, crossed his arms. His expression was one of thinly veiled disappointment. "That's a good question, Whitaker. Care to explain why one of our most valued clients, our biggest investor, was left waiting for 2 hours while others were served before him?" The color drained from Whitaker's face. There must have been a mix-up," he stammered, his voice cracking. "I didn't realize." Jordan took a step forward, not aggressive, not loud, just enough to make Whitaker flinch. "Didn't realize," Jordan repeated, his voice low and controlled. "Or didn't care." Whitaker's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. His confidence, the smugness he had displayed earlier, was gone. Another board member, a tall woman in a navy blue power suit, tapped her nails against her folded arms. "Mr. Bennett has been one of our most crucial partners for years. His investments have directly contributed to the growth of this institution. And this is how he's treated." Whitaker was visibly shaking now. Jordan glanced at his watch. 2 hours. That's a long time to wait, isn't it? He looked up, piercing Whitaker with his stare. "So tell me, Mr. Whitaker, what exactly was the reason for my wait?" Silence. And in that silence, the weight of every unspoken truth came crashing down. Whitaker knew the answer. Everyone in the room knew the answer. But saying it out loud, that was career suicide. The bank manager swallowed thickly. His lips trembled, but no sound came out. Jordan exhaled sharply through his nose, then nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "That's what I thought." He turned toward the board members. "Shall we?" The chairman nodded, glancing at Whitaker one last time. "We'll be having a long discussion about this." As the executives moved toward the private conference room, with Jordan leading the way, Whitaker stood frozen in place, his entire world crumbling around him. He had made a fatal mistake, and now he was going to pay for it. Whitaker stood there, his breath shallow, his palms clammy. He had lost control. The man he had dismissed, ignored, and humiliated was now leading the most powerful people in the company into a meeting that would determine his fate. The whispers started almost immediately. Employees at their desks exchanged wide-eyed glances, their hushed voices barely concealing the shock in the air. Even the customers in line, those who had watched Jordan sit patiently for 2 hours, were leaning in, sensing the shift in power. Whitaker turned, desperate to reclaim some dignity, but then a voice cut through the tension. "That was a hell of a mistake, Tom." He spun around. It was Mark, one of the senior loan officers, a man who had been in the bank for over a decade. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't gloating. He was just stating a fact. Whitaker tried to force a chuckle. I didn't know who he was." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Didn't you?" Whitaker froze. Because that was the real question, wasn't it? Had he really not known? Or had he just assumed Jordan wasn't important? Had he simply seen a black man in a waiting area and decided, without a second thought, that he could be ignored? The weight of that truth pressed down on him like a collapsing ceiling. And then, the double doors to the private conference room clicked shut. Whitaker stood there, locked out, powerless, his fate being decided without him. Jordan took his seat at the large glass table, the board members settling around him. The room was sleek, minimalistic, just like the kind of corporate spaces he had spent years in. Except this time, he wasn't here to prove himself. He was here to watch justice unfold. The chairman folded his hands in front of him. "Jordan, before we begin, I want to personally apologize for what happened out there." Jordan met his gaze. "It's not about me. It's about what this says about the company." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Jordan leaned back slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Let's be honest. This isn't just about one branch manager making a bad decision. It's about the culture that let him think he could get away with it. That's the real problem." The room fell into a heavy silence. No one dared to argue, because Jordan was right. Finally, the woman in the navy blue power suit, Karen Mitchell, one of the company's top executives, cleared her throat. "So what do you think we should do?" Jordan didn't hesitate. "First, he needs to be removed. Not just as a warning, but because someone like that should never be in a leadership position." The chairman nodded slowly. No one disagreed. Jordan continued. "Second, this bank needs to implement serious training and oversight. If he felt comfortable doing that to me, a high-value investor, imagine how he treats regular customers who don't have my resources." Karen sighed. "We've had complaints before, but nothing concrete enough to act on." Jordan scoffed. "You have something concrete now." The chairman exhaled. Yes, we do." A beat of silence passed. Then he picked up the phone. "Get Thomas Whitaker in here." Whitaker was still standing near the reception desk, his hands trembling, when the call came through. "The board wants to see you. Now." Every inch of his skin prickled with dread. Slowly, he turned toward the glass conference room where Jordan sat at the table, a man he had dismissed now sitting in judgment. Whitaker swallowed hard. This was it. The walk to that door felt like a death march. And when he finally stepped inside, Jordan didn't even bother to look up. The conference room door clicked shut behind Whitaker, sealing him in with the very people who now held his future in their hands. His throat was dry, his palms slick with sweat, but he forced himself to stand tall. Maybe, just maybe, he could talk his way out of this. Jordan sat at the head of the table, his fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. He didn't need to look at Whitaker. The silence alone was enough to make the man squirm. The chairman broke the quiet first. His tone was cold, calculated. "Mr. Whitaker, do you know why you're here?" Whitaker cleared his throat, struggling to keep his voice steady. I assume this is about the miscommunication earlier. I sincerely regret any inconvenience caused and I—" Jordan let out a sharp, humorless chuckle. It was the first sound he had made since Whitaker entered the room, and it was devastating. "Miscommunication?" Jordan finally spoke, his voice smooth but lethal. "You call making me wait for 2 hours while helping every white customer before me a miscommunication?" Whitaker's mouth opened and closed. No words came out. The tall woman in the navy blue suit, Karen Mitchell, leaned forward, tapping her manicured nails on the table. "We've been reviewing security footage. Your treatment of Mr. Bennett wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern." The chairman slid a folder across the table. "We also received a formal complaint from a customer just last month about your discriminatory behavior. You remember a Mrs. Linda Carter?" Whitaker's face drained of color. He absolutely remembered. A black woman in her late 60s who had come in to ask about refinancing her mortgage. He had dismissed her concerns, suggesting she look into more affordable options. Apparently, she had filed a complaint. Apparently, that complaint had not been forgotten. "Mr. Whitaker," the chairman said, his tone leaving no room for argument, "your behavior is a legal liability. Not only have you created an environment of exclusion, but your actions today have placed this institution's reputation at risk." Whitaker panicked. "Sir, please, It was never my intention." Jordan tilted his head. "Never your intention?" His voice remained low, almost calm. "So tell me, what exactly was your intention when you made me wait 2 hours while personally greeting every white customer who walked in?" Whitaker's breathing turned shallow. There was no way out of this. Karen folded her arms. The truth is, you didn't think twice about it. And that's exactly the problem. The weight of reality crashed over Whitaker. He had been caught. There were no excuses, no justifications, no smooth talking his way out of this one. The chairman exhaled deeply and looked Whitaker dead in the eye. Clean out your office. Effective immediately. Your employment with this institution is terminated. The finality in his voice sent a shock through Whitaker's system. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. This was the end. His stomach dropped. His hands shook. Jordan finally looked up at him. And what he saw? A man who had built his world on arrogance and assumptions, watching it all crumble to dust. Whitaker's mouth fell open, but no words came out. Fired. Just like that. He felt his pulse hammering in his throat. His career, his status, everything he had built over the years was gone in an instant. Wait, he choked out. This can't be permanent. There must be something we can do. Karen Mitchell, the tall executive, leaned back in her chair, unimpressed. You're right, she said coolly. We can ensure that this doesn't happen again, by making an example out of you. The chairman nodded. We're reporting this to corporate and making immediate changes to prevent further discrimination in our branches. Whitaker's head snapped up. You're making this public? Jordan smirked. It wasn't the smug kind of smile Whitaker had worn when he dismissed him 2 hours ago. It was the kind that said justice was finally being served. Oh, absolutely, Jordan said. Because you see, Whitaker, this isn't just about you losing your job. It's about making sure that no one else in this bank, no one else in this industry, ever pulls something like this again. Whitaker felt nausea rising. He wasn't just being fired, he was being exposed. You're free to leave, the chairman added. Security will escort you out. Whitaker's legs felt like lead as he turned toward the door. The moment he stepped out of the conference room, the entire bank was watching. His employees, the customers, even the receptionist who had avoided Jordan's eyes earlier. They all knew. The whispers started immediately. Some people shook their heads, others just stared. But the moment of pure humiliation came when a customer, a black woman with graying hair, locked eyes with Whitaker, Mrs. Linda Carter. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her slow, knowing shake of the head said everything. Whitaker felt the blood drain from his face, and when security appeared, silently gesturing for him to follow, he knew this wasn't just a bad day. This was the day his name became a cautionary tale. Whitaker's steps were slow, heavy. Each one felt like a step toward oblivion. He had walked these halls for years with a sense of untouchable authority. Employees once scrambled to impress him, to stay in his good graces. Now, they averted their eyes, or, worse, they stared, unblinking, with something close to satisfaction. Security flanked him, their presence a reminder that his time here was over. As he passed the waiting area, the sight of Jordan Bennett standing tall sent another surge of humiliation through him. Jordan had every right to ignore him, to let him slink away like a disgraced animal. But instead, Jordan spoke. Mr. Whitaker. Whitaker froze. Slowly, he turned. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin, brittle line. Yes? Jordan stepped forward, adjusting the cuff of his suit. The same suit Whitaker had dismissed as unimportant just hours ago. His voice was calm, measured, but there was an unmistakable edge behind it. You should have treated me with the same respect you so freely gave others. Whitaker's mouth twitched, as if searching for an apology that might save him. But it was too late. Jordan's next words ended any last shred of dignity Whitaker was clinging to. This bank will be better without you. And trust me, so will I. It was final. No shouting, no dramatic revenge speech. Just the cold, inescapable truth. Whitaker swallowed hard, then lowered his gaze. He had no choice but to accept it. Security opened the doors, and as he stepped outside into the daylight, he realized he would never walk back in. The tension that had suffocated the room just minutes ago was gone. Employees straightened their backs. Conversations felt lighter. It was as if a weight had been lifted from the entire building. The chairman turned to Jordan. We owe you more than an apology, Mr. Bennett. Jordan shook his head. I don't need an apology. I need action. Karen Mitchell nodded. We're launching a full review of all our branches. Discriminatory behavior like this won't just be punished, it'll be prevented. Jordan let out a breath. Finally. He had fought his battles before. He had walked away from places that refused to see his worth. But this time, he had made them see it. As he walked out of the conference room, employees turned to him. Not with pity, not with awkward glances, but with respect. He had arrived at the bank as just another customer. He was leaving as the man who changed it. As Jordan stepped out of the bank, the warm sunlight kissed his face. This time, it felt different. Not just because Whitaker was gone, not just because justice had been served, but because something bigger had happened. Change. For years, people like Whitaker had thrived in positions of power, making quiet decisions that kept people like Jordan waiting, questioning, feeling less than. But today, that cycle ended. Jordan pulled out his phone and sent a quick text. "It's done. We need to talk next steps." Within seconds, his screen lit up with a response. "Already ahead of you. The media is asking for a statement." He exhaled slowly, then typed back. "Good. Let's make sure they hear the whole story. Because this wasn't just about one bank, one racist manager, one act of discrimination. This was about an entire system that needed to change." He glanced back at the bank where employees still whispered, their faces a mix of realization and silent gratitude. They had seen what real accountability looked like. The chairman and Karen Mitchell stepped outside, catching up to him. "Jordan," the chairman said, his voice more respectful now, "we really do want to do better. If you have ideas on how we can improve, we'd like to hear them." Jordan studied him for a moment. For once, a leader wasn't just offering empty words. He nodded. "Let's set up a meeting. I'm not done with this place just yet." Karen smiled. "Neither are we." As Jordan walked away, he didn't just feel victorious. He felt powerful. Not because he had money, not because of the connections he had built, but because he had forced people to see what they refused to see. And now, they would never unsee it. A news broadcast played in a lounge inside the very same bank. Employees crowded around as the anchor spoke. Following the viral incident at the city's leading financial institution, major policy changes have been introduced to prevent racial discrimination in banking services. The former manager, Thomas Whitaker, has faced public scrutiny and will likely never work in finance again. A younger bank employee leaned toward his colleague. "Can you believe that actually happened here?" The older employee nodded. It needed to. And sitting in his high-rise office across town, Jordan Bennett watched the broadcast, a small, knowing smile on his face. Justice had been served. Change had begun. And this was only the start. The news coverage wasn't just a headline, it was a shockwave. Banks across the country were suddenly under scrutiny. Customers, especially black professionals and business owners, began sharing their own stories of being ignored, disrespected, or denied service based on assumptions. Jordan's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. "Mr. Bennett, we'd love for you to speak at our next diversity summit." "Jordan, CNN wants an interview. Can you talk about what happened?" "Boss, we've got offers pouring in. Companies want to sponsor initiatives. What's the move?" He took a deep breath, staring out at the city skyline from his office. This was bigger than just a bank. It was a wake-up call. For Whitaker, the nightmare didn't end with losing his job. A video had surfaced, security footage from the bank, showing his smug grin as he skipped over Jordan's name, time, and time again. The clip went viral on social media. Millions watched in outrage. His name became a symbol of corporate racism. Companies refused to hire him. His professional connections stopped returning his calls. His reputation ruined. One night he sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, staring at the TV as a news anchor spoke. In the wake of his termination, former bank manager Thomas Whitaker has remained silent. Attempts to reach him for comment have been unsuccessful. Whitaker clenched his jaw. Silent? No, he was hiding. He had spent years looking down on others, but now he was the one being judged. Jordan didn't just want justice. He wanted change that lasted. He and his team launched an independent watchdog organization that monitored racial discrimination in financial institutions. Banks that failed, exposed, banks that improved, recognized and celebrated. Within 6 months, New policies were introduced at multiple institutions. Policies that ensured customers like Jordan never had to wait 2 hours just to be acknowledged again. And when Jordan was invited to speak at the National Banking Conference, he stood on stage, looked out at the room full of executives and said, "If you don't fix your institutions, the world will fix them for you." The crowd sat in stunned silence. They knew he was right. Final scene. 1 year later, a young black entrepreneur walked into the same bank where it all started. This time, he was greeted immediately. A banker smiled warmly. "Good morning, sir. How can we assist you today?" He exhaled, relieved. This was how it should have always been. As he sat down, he glanced at the television on the wall, playing an interview with Jordan Bennett. The caption read, "How one man forced a broken system to change." The young entrepreneur smiled. Because thanks to Jordan, the fight wasn't just won, it had inspired a revolution.